welcome to this class on financial performance measurement. This is part 8 of this topic. Today we'll discuss the issue of criteria versus indicators. And the outline of the class will be organized as follows. First of all, we'll have an introductory discussion on criteria versus indicators, where we'll see that indicators per se do not provide a final judgment about the value of a project until we compare this indicator with some criteria that have to be met by the project. Then we'll give a look at what we mean for dynamic criteria, and then we'll see how the inflation issue is an impact on dynamic criteria. So how we have to correct dynamic criteria to account for the potential impact of inflation. So let's start from the first topic, that is criteria versus indicators. So up to this point, we have worked on a wide set of financial indicators. Some of them were static and refer to some moment in time. Some other were dynamic because they were taking into consideration the benefits that the project generates in its whole time span. However, nor the static or dynamic indicators provide a final judgment about the value of the project until they are compared with some kind of a criteria. Because the question is, when we calculate financial indicators, is the value that I get satisfying or not? This introduces another question, that is, what are the satisfying values that I should get for a given indicator? This is true for both static indicators, that as we know refer to some precise moment in time in the life of the project, and dynamic indicators that instead more comprehensively include all the cash flow generated by the project in the life. So in order to answer this question, so what are the satisfying values of financial indicators, we have to define criteria. And the answer is the values are satisfying, the value of financial indicators are satisfying to the extent that they meet some predefined criteria that reflects the expectation of investors and the appropriateness of the value of the financial indicators. So let's look at the second point, that is dynamic criteria. So what are the possible applicable dynamic criteria? And the issue of dynamic criteria is different depending on whether we are dealing with the ARR method or the MPV method. We have different answers depending on which one of the two we choose. So we have seen that when we calculate the ARR, that is the rate of return of the project, given its cash flow structure, we got some rate of return expressed as a percentage. Okay, so this IRR indicates what is the yearly return that an investor or all the investors get on this project. But is this really satisfactory? So what we say, even though it's positive, clearly if it's negative, it's clear that no one wants a negative return on its investment. But if it's positive, the questions that we tried to answer in the previous class is, what is the minimum value of this indicator that we could consider acceptable? So this means that we have to define a criteria in terms of cutoff rate. So cutoff rate means that we have to select some rate of return that we think is appropriate for this project, and therefore the project becomes convenient if the IRR is higher than the cutoff rate, and it's not convenient if the IRR is below the cutoff rate. So the cutoff rate becomes the criterion that allows us to judge whether the IRR is satisfying and whether the project passes or not the cutoff, so whether the project can be funded or not. So in other words, the IRR has no meaning at all until we compare it with some criterion expressed in terms of a cutoff rate, that is a minimum rate return that we expect from this project, for some reasons that we analyze in a moment. Instead, when we analyze the NPV, we know that given the way we build the NPV, the project should be realized if the NPV is greater than 0, so if the project is creating value for the investors. But however, this valuation will critically depend, as we have already examined in the previous classes, on the choice of some discount rate. That is basically the discount rate that the investors are imposing on this project. So it's the rate of return that the investors are expecting from this project, given its risk characteristics and clearly market conditions. So here, the ability of a project to be funded based on the NPV criteria on the NPV indicator will depend on the definition on some hurdle rate that will use a discount rate for the cash flows, and this hurdle rate will be set by the investors and will depend by their expectations of returns given the risk characteristics of the project and given the market condition of the interest rate in general. So this discussion introduces another question, that is, how is the appropriate rate selected? So both the cutoff rate in the case of IRR and the other rate in the case of NPV need to be selected in some way. So we need some specific rule to follow in order to set the cutoff of the hurdle rate, depending on the interpretation we give of the expected rate of return. And in this slide, we summarize two approaches that have already been discussed in previous classes. One refers to the so-called opportunity cost of capital. So here I briefly recall the definition of opportunity cost of capital. So when I invest in a project, the opportunity cost of capital is the rate of return that I could obtain by the best alternative investment having the same risk as the project that I am evaluating in this moment. So in other words, a solution for establishing the cutoff rate for IRR or the hurdle rate for the NPV is to find a project that has the same risk as the project I'm evaluating, define its rate of return, and use this rate of return as a minimum rate of return that I can expect from this project, because if the rate of return of this project is lower, then I will lose money by investing in this project and not choosing the alternative investment. So in order to understand better how the opportunity cost of capital works for NPV and IRR, we can have a simple example. So let's assume that my project is an IRR of 10%, and the opportunity cost of capital, that is the rate of return of the best alternative investment, is 12%. So what does it mean? This means that this project I'm evaluating is offering an expected rate of return of 10% a year, whereas the best alternative investment is offering a 12% rate of return. So this means that the investment is not convenient because its IRR is below the cutoff rate that is represented by the opportunity cost of capital. So it will not make sense to invest in this project when by taking the same risk I could invest in alternative projects that will have a higher rate of return. And the same expected rate of return of 12% could be used for the calculation of NPV. In particular, I could use a discount rate of 12% to discount the operating cash flows of the project. And given the relationship existing between IRR and NPV, if the IRR is 10% and the discount rate is 12%, I would expect a negative NPV. That means that, again, the project is not convenient. So in this case, this is because the opportunity cost of capital is higher than the IRR of the project. And this can be interpreted both in terms of cutoff rate or hurdle rate. So in other words, the project does not pass the cutoff rate or does not pass the discount rate is higher than the hurdle rate. Another way that we could follow in order to estimate the appropriate rate to select as a cutoff rate or hurdle rate is the weighted average cost of capital, WACC, that we have already analyzed in a previous class. So here the approach is completely different. I'm not looking at the return or the best alternative investment having the same risk, but I'm asking a different question, and the question is probably more simple to understand, because it's what is the cost of my sources of financing? As we know, a project, in order to be realized, requires financing for initial investment and to cover the eventual outflows during the life of the project. These sources of financing are coming from creditors or financiers on one side and equity holder on the other side. We already discussed this, each source of finance has a different cost of capital that is aggregated into the weighted average cost of capital by the calculation of weighted average of the cost of capital of the different sources of funding, where the weights of the average are represented by the weights of debt and equity in the total financial structure. So the WACC is a very interesting parameter because it's a synthetic indicator of what is the cost of each dollar of capital that is raised for this project. So saying that the weighted average cost of capital is 8%, it means that for each dollar of capital that I raise for funding this project, I'm paying yearly the 8% of interest or of return to the investors. What does that imply in terms of cutoff rate or hurdle rate? So if for each dollar that I'm investing in the project, I'm paying an 8% of cost of capital, this means that the IRR of this investment is to be higher than the 8%. This is a simple consideration that derives from the fact that typically if you want to create value, you have to invest your money at a rate of return higher than the cost of this money. So the WACC is saying what the money is costing to you for this project. You know that WACC is 8%. If you want to create value for the investors, you have to invest the money that you raised at a rate of return that is higher than the 8%. So in this sense, the WACC represents both the cutoff rate for the IRR, in the sense that the IRR is to be higher than the 8% in order to make the project convenient, or is the hurdle rate for the NPV, in the sense that NPV cannot accept discount rates that are not consistent with this hurdle rate. So in other words, we use WACC as a hurdle rate to discount the operating cash flows, and then we get the NPV as a result. So say that NPV and IRR are typically financial indicators that can be compared with financial criteria in order to understand whether the project is feasible or not. Let's try to understand now in a more complete way whether it's better to use NPV or IRR. Well, the first thing that we already anticipated in the previous class is that in general, if you have a conventional project, NPV and IRR criteria result in the same decisions. Now, leaving apart the limitation of the IRR, what we have seen is that in general for normal project, when the NPV is positive, the IRR is higher than the discount rate, so than the cutoff rate. So this means that the NPV and the IRR are providing the same answer about the convenience of the project. We could have, however, some problems when we have so-called non-conventional projects where NPV and IRR criteria provides contrasting indications. So in this case, we could have different suggestions using the two methods, and therefore we have to understand what to do. Well, this is typically the case of mutually exclusive projects, as we'll see, and the specific condition that we'll examine in a moment. But the general suggestion that is provided in this case is that when NPV and IRR are providing contrasting indication, so the best solution is always to refer to the NPV, and the reason is very simple. The NPV criterion referring to the value, monetary value created by the project, is an objective and definitive signal of the value of a project, whereas the IRR, being a rate of return in some case, can provide confusing indications about the value of a project. This I was anticipating before. The problem of having conflicting indication of NPV and IRR typically happens in the case of exclusive projects, mutually exclusive projects. So I have to choose one among two projects that exclude each other, typically for technical reasons. So in the cases, for example, where I should choose different technical solutions for the same commercial application, so I will have I can choose clearly just one of the two solutions, so I will have mutually exclusive projects with different cash flows. And in this case, it can happen that if I apply NPV and IRR, they provide contrasting indications. So what does it mean? That, for example, the NPV of project 1 is higher than the NPV of project 2, but at the same time, the IRR of project 2 is higher than the NPV of project 1. This typically happens when this mutually exclusive project presents some characteristics. It's not necessarily true that when we have mutually exclusive projects, we have contrasting indication of NPV and IRR, but this happens when there are particular characteristics. First of all, there are projects that present a different cash flow patterns in terms of timing. So this means that, for example, there is a project that concentrated most of the cash flow in the earlier phases of its life, and there is the second project that has cash flow mainly concentrated in the later parts of its life. So in this case, it could happen that the IRR is higher for the project with the earlier cash flows, even though the NPV of this project is not necessarily higher. It can then happen when the project has different initial investment. So it can happen that, for example, I have a project with a lower investment that has higher return for the investor, but at the same time has a lower NPV because its size is lower. So in the end, the project that creates more value is a project with the larger size, larger NPV, and the lower IRR, because even though in terms of return, this project is apparently less convenient for the investor, it's anyhow the project that creates the more value for the investor if we look at the net present value. It also happens when the project that I compare have different lives. So I have a project longer than another, and it can happen that the IRR is higher for the project with the shorter life, even though the project with the longer life is a higher NPV. So in the end, the suggestion is that what matters for the decision of which project to fund is which project is creating more value in monetary terms for the investor. So the monetary value is expressed not by IRR but by NPV. And so the best solution is not looking in this case at the returns, but looking at the monetary indicators of the value created by the projects, that is the NPV. And so this should lead the decision between the two mutually exclusive projects. And in the last topic about the dynamic criteria is impact of financial leverage and on cutoff rates. So now we have already discussed it in the calculation of the cost of capital, the different financial structures in terms of different proportions of debt and equity can have an impact on the cost of capital. This is because debt and equity have a different cost. So if you combine them differently within the financial structure, this in the end will affect the cost of capital. And therefore, if we take the cost of capital as a cutoff rate, the different choices about the financial leverage will lower or will increase the cutoff rate, and so will change our decisions about the convenience of a project. Without being so analytical, without going too much into details here, I provide a very intuitive example that, however, explains in a very clear way how the financial leverage can change our decision about the project, in particular, how different financing conditions can change our decisions about the convenience of a project. So here I don't go into the details of balancing equity and debt, but I just consider a project that is funded 100% by debt. So I'm not considering what is the effect of including equity into the decision, but I'm looking at a project that being realized within an existing structure, existing organization, can be funded since 100% by raising new debt. And let's assume that given its cash flow patterns, this project is an IRR of 10%. So as we know at this point, this IRR is independent of how much debt I will raise for the project and what is the cost of this debt. The 10% IRR is only determined by the cash flows that the project will be generating in the future and their time pattern. So the loan that I'm negotiating, it's an initial loan A with the bank. Its initial interest rate is 12%. So I'm able to raise a new loan for this project by paying a 12% interest rate at the bank. As you can understand, under these financing conditions, the project is not convenient because I'm paying 12% for the amount of money that I'm raising to fund the project as a debt, and on this amount of money that is reinvested into the project, I'm earning a return of 10%. So the cutoff rate is higher than the IRR. It's not convenient to invest in this project. The cost of capital, in this case represented by the interest rate, is higher than the return on the project, so it's clear that the project is not convenient. However, let's assume that nothing changes about the project, so the cash flows will be always the same. The IRR will not change because the IRR will change only if the cash flow of that time pattern changes, but in this case I'm supposing no change in the cash flow structure. But what happens is that something instead happens in the financing side, and what happens is that I have the possibility of negotiating a loan B with another bank that is proposing for the same amount of money, the same maturity, and the same risk, an interest rate of 9%. So what happens now? What happens is that now the cutoff rate that I'm considering for this project decreases from the 12% of loan A to 9% of loan B. And as the IRR of the project is equal to 10%, this means that now the IRR is higher than the cutoff rate that I would have if I decide to raise loan B, as now the cost of capital that I'm raising is 9%, whereas the return that I get on the capital invested in the project is 10%. So just by changing the loan and changing the cost of the loan, the value of the project becomes positive and the IRR becomes higher than the cutoff rate, and the project becomes convenient. So in this case, I have not modified at all the operational characteristics of the project. I'm just changing the financing structure. And by changing the financial structure, I've been able to increase the value of the project and to change my decision about the convenience of the project that passed from rejection to approval. So this is a very simple example. It's simplistic because clearly we are only considering the cost of debt, but shows in a very clear way that when you are evaluating a project, not only the operations cash flow matter, but also the way you decide to fund the project. So this is an important component you should consider when evaluating a project. So the final topic of this class is about the inflation and its effect on the application on dynamic criteria. So what is the problem here? The problem is that in theory, project can be appraised both at current or constant prices. So what does it mean? It means that, as we know, in order to appraise the project, we have to estimate the cash flows that will be generated by these projects. So these operations cash flow, as you know, include both the inflows from revenues, the outflows from cost, the outflow from investment, and the level of cost and revenues and investment may change over time, not only because of changing quantities or in production issues, but also because of changing in prices. And inflation is a normal phenomenon in economies, so you expect that the sale price typically increases over time at a given rate. And you expect at the same time also the cost of the inputs of production increases over time due to inflation. So we'll see that the inflation rate affecting the sales price can be different from the inflation rate affecting the cost of the inputs. So this is something we'll have to consider in our decision about dynamic criteria. But what matters at this moment is that when you predict your cash flow, you can adopt two choices. Either you predict cash flows with revenues and cost at current prices. This means that you are incorporating inflation into your prediction, so the revenues and the cost reflects the future prices that accounts for inflation. Or you can make the same estimations at constant prices. So you take the prices at moment zero, so at the present moment, and you assume no change at all. So you're assuming that there is no inflation, or at least let's say that you don't count for inflation in the estimation of your cash flows. However, this can be a problem because the cost of capital is typically expressed in nominal terms, because the interest that you negotiate with the bank, for example, is a nominal interest rate that already includes the expectation of inflation of the bank when setting the price for the loan. And also the rate of return of equity holders include their expectation of inflation about the future periods. So the cost of capital we use as cutoff rate for IRR or as a discount rate for NPV is a nominal one and is affected by inflation. So we can express the nominal cost of capital as the real rate of return plus the inflation rate. Or you could say that once that you define the nominal rate as cost of capital, the real rate, the real cost of capital can be obtained by subtracting the expected inflation rate from the nominal rate. So the problem here is that if we decide to use cash flow at constant prices, we cannot discount them using a nominal cost of capital because the cash flows and the cost of capital will be inconsistent is the cash flow do not include the inflation, whereas the cost of capital does include inflation. And this clearly creates a problem for the calculation of the NPV. Moreover, if you calculate the IRR on cash flows at constant prices, this is not comparable with the nominal cost of capital for the same reason as before. Because the IRR at this point it can be seen as a real rate of return, so that does not account for inflation, whereas the cost of capital is nominal rate of return, so does account for inflation, and therefore the two are not comparable. And you cannot use the nominal cost of capital as a cutoff rate when the IRR is calculated without inflation. This means that if you want to work on predictions of cash flows at constant prices, and if you want to use IRR on cash flows at constant prices, you have to modify update rates and cutoff rates in order to account for inflation appropriately. So let's make an example to understand why he could have a problem in using the ARR on cash flow of at constant prices. So let's look at what are the possible problems of using the ARR is at constant prices and compare that with a cutoff rate expressed in terms instead in terms of a nominal interest rate. Here in this example, we have a project with a life of 5 years. We have an initial investment at time 0, and we report here the operating cash flows in 2 different columns at constant and current prices. So in the face of the 2 columns, the operating cash flows have been calculated on the basis of revenues and costs without inflation, so that the prices are the prices at time 0, and we have the 4,000 operating cash flow 4,000 in year 1, 5,000 in year 2, 6,000 in year 3, 4, and 5. Instead, on the right column, these cash flows are adjusted assuming an inflation rate of 10%, and assuming that this inflation rate affects proportionally all the components of the cash flow. So it has the same effect on both revenues and costs, so that the cash flows grows proportionally with inflation. And here we calculate the ARR on both the operating cash flows calculated at constant prices and the operating cash flow calculated at current prices. And what we can see is that clearly the IRR calculated on cash flows at constant prices is much lower than the IRR calculated on the operating cash flow at the current prices. This is not a surprise because operating cash flow at current prices will be higher because of inflation. But now the problem is that if our cost of capital is expressed in nominal terms, this will be a problem because it will not be consistent with the 21.6% because the cost of capital accounts for inflation. So the current IRR with which it should be compared is the IRR calculated on the operating cash flows at current prices, that is this one. So if we have a nominal cost of capital as a cutoff rate, the correct IRR that we should take is this one on the right, so 33.8%, that is calculated on the operating cash flows that are calculated on the basis on current prices. But however, this does not mean necessarily that in presence of inflation, we cannot use the ARR calculated on the operations cash flows at constant prices. Simply, we can refer to this ARR, but we have to compare this ARR with the real cost of capital. So this means that we have to adjust the nominal cost of capital for inflation, and starting from the nominal cost of capital, getting and cleaning that from inflation, get the real cost of capital that at this point is totally comparable with the ARR calculated on the operation cash flows at constant prices. So we can have 2 choices. One is to compare the ARR calculated on the operations cash flows at current prices with the nominal cost of capital, or to compare the ARR calculated on the operations cash flows at constant prices with the real cost of capital after that has been corrected for inflation. So the last question that we have about inflation is considering that the 2 approaches are both correct, so we can either compare an IRR at constant prices with the real cost of capital, or compare an IRR on, with current prices with the nominal cost of capital. So what we should choose? Should we work on constant prices or current prices? So in this table, what I highlight is that the choice between constant prices and current prices approaches depends on the conditions of inflation. We'll see that under some conditions, constant prices are preferable, and under some other conditions, current prices are preferable. But that the choice of constant prices and current prices will have an impact on the choices of the other rate, of the cutoff rate that we'll choose for project evaluation. In particular, it can happen that all inputs and outputs of a project are affected equally by inflation. So this means that the revenues and the costs are subjected to the same rate of inflation. So this means that the approach of custom prices is much more easy to be applied and is more feasible. So it could be convenient working on custom prices instead on current prices. This would also avoid working in the prediction on inflation adjustment of the cash flow, and probably will bring to a simpler approach. However, we have to remember that if we apply the approach of custom prices, when we use the other rate as discount rate, or where we use a cutoff rate as a comparison with the ARR, we have to work on the real cost of capital that is equal to the nominal cost of capital that we have already calculated, adjusted for the inflation rate. So you are comparing basically variables that are calculated at custom prices with the real cost of capital. On the other side, the approach of custom prices could become problematic when inflation affects differently inputs and outputs. So the sales price could grow at a growth rate different from the input, like the cost of labor or the cost of raw materials. So if each of these items has a different inflation rate, the approach of custom prices is not feasible anymore. So it's better to estimate future cash flows working on current prices. And this will bring to cash flow that already includes inflation in the estimation. So at this point, there will be no problem in using the nominal cost of capital as a hurdle rate for discounting, or as a cutoff rate to compare the IRR of the project. So again, the choice between cost and current prices basically depends on the conditions of inflation, in particular how inflation affects the different items of the cash flows. But what we have to remember that independently of the choice, the fact that these reasons, the fact that we choose one or the other approach will have an impact on the hurdle rate that we have to use for discounting or for comparison with the ARR. So this class is ended. I thank you for attention, and I remind you that you will find additional materials on this class on the course website. Thank you.